Attorney-General Christian Porter, who is speaking.
Utilising the special purpose aircrafts from the RAAF to enable that to happen for some members because of the lack of commercial flights. We'll obviously be trying to do that in a way that it is as safe as possible in this building, as safe as possible for the return of members to their local communities, abiding by the variety of restrictions and exemptions that each of the states have in place with respect to passage in and out and across their borders. So that is a basic summary of what will occur next Wednesday. With respect to the drafting for the JobKeeper payment system, I think it's fair to say it's probably one of the most important drafting exercises post-World War II. It will facilitate $130 billion worth of economy-saving and job-saving expenditure. There is a lot of progress. It's occurring under enormous time pressure. There are two halves to the legislative process, one being drafted through Treasury, one being drafted in my department and my office dealing with the industrial relations matters. The drafting's progressed to a point where we'll likely be able to marry up those two halves, fit them together and ensure that they operate seamlessly to facilitate the system of payment. That'll occur tomorrow, and then final stress testing around that legislation so that we should have drafts up and running finally on Monday. With respect to the IR side, if I can explain the essential difficulty and challenge that we're dealing with in this way, I think there's agreement amongst all people who have knowledge and experience in industrial relations and employment relations in Australia that for the system to work, you have to make changes to the way in which the employment relations and industrial relations system in Australia presently operates. Now, those changes would be time-bound. They would only last for as long as the payment system lasted. But without those changes, even if it were the case that a business would face a situation where it would otherwise have to let an employee go so that they had no job and no wage and no way to provide for their family, without changes to the IR system and the employment relations system, that's what would happen, rather than the employee getting the $1,500 in substitution of a normal wage. So we must change the system. Now, I've been working very, very cooperatively with Sally McManus and the ACTU and with the assistance of Greg Combay on the Prime Minister's Commission. There's been enormous progress on a number of matters in the industrial relations system. We will not be waiting or hoping that this change can be effected over the coming weeks or months by changing 121 awards and thousands of individual enterprise agreements. This change will be happening next Wednesday. No matter how late we have to sit, the change will be happening next Wednesday. 6 million Australian jobs depend on it. Next Wednesday, we are pushing a $130 billion lifeboat out into the roughest economic seas Australia has ever seen, and people will need to decide whether or not they're going to help us push that boat out, but it is going out on Wednesday. And we are not going to be arguing about timing and process and speculative possibilities in the weeks and months to come. This and the changes necessary to make JobKeeper happen are happening next Wednesday.
So what comfort can you give to the ACTU? You said that you've been working very cooperatively with them, that it won't be rorted, that it is time-bound and that people won't be asked to take their leave now from workplaces where they don't need to do that.
I'll be sharing drafts with the ACTU. I'll be working those drafts through line by line in a cooperative, open, frank and honest way with the ACTU. I want them to have comfort that what we are doing is time-bound, that it has the requisite safeguards and mechanisms in it to ensure that there's not rorting of the system. But ultimately, the laws need to change to allow people to receive $1,500 where they otherwise would have received nothing because the business was unviable. If you don't change the laws, people don't get the money and they can't pay their mortgage. It's that simple. So we'll be doing this in a cooperative way, but we won't be waiting weeks or months for thousands of individual agreements to get changed.
What about the issue of the 1.1 million casual workers who may have been working for a long time but just not for a single employer and therefore don't qualify? Will you have flexibility to allow those people to access JobKeeper?
So that's a definitional piece of drafting, and obviously you have to have some definition to include people. We've tried to come up with a definition which is inclusive as possible. We're working around the edges of that definition at the moment. We've been listening to what Sally McManus and the ACTU have said, Of course, for many people, because of the fact that the definition in principle that we will use has no limit on the number of hours that people have worked, that someone might have been attached to a business for over 12 months but only worked a day a week, and they will receive a very significant increase. Now, we acknowledge that there are many people who are regularly employed casually but who may move from employer to employer. There is always going to have to be some definition. We're working on that. We are listening. So when you will see the final draft, you'll see that we're trying to be as inclusive and reasonable as possible. Of course, there are other safety nets in the system through the JobKeeper payments, the doubling in effect of Newstart that we've allowed for, that provide a safety net for someone who won't be in the employment side of this. But we are listening. We're doing this under extreme time pressure, and we are trying to make sure that the result is as inclusive and fair and reasonable and job-saving as it possibly can be.
Sally McManus did offer a definition today. I think she came up with a reasonable test, that if you could have reasonably expected that you would have been working were it not for the coronavirus crisis, then you should get the JobKeeper payment. Are you willing to acknowledge that sort of test, or is that the path you're going down?
I'll be looking at her suggestion over the course of today. The test that we've adopted is essentially a test that exists already in the Fair Work Act. One of the initial instinctive difficulties I've had with that formulation of words is that it's so rubbery I can't quite tell you what it would mean in practice, which is always going to be a difficulty. But look, we are listening, right? We're doing it in short time. We're trying to make the definition reasonable and inclusive. And there will be, as Sally McManus said in this today, in her language, swings and roundabouts. Some people will find themselves being paid significantly more than their usual wage because they're part-time or casual. Some people will be in a business that just wouldn't be viable unless it's $1,500 being paid, which might be less than their usual wage. Some people will find that their usual wage is subsidised with $1,500 and they're still paid their usual wage. Much will depend on the nature and status of the viability of the business. So all of that is a matter of quite complicated drafting that we're working through.
On the industrial relations, the Prime Minister talks about the snapback. Is that going to be, for the assurance of the union movement and for others, is snapback going to be set in a sunset clause with a hard date of 6 months? Can that be varied by you, by regulation, or does that require further approval by Parliament if this amendment to the Fair Work Act is going to run for more than 6 months?
So the present intention for the drafting of both the JobKeeper payment and the IR changes that are necessary to make it work are that it's all time-bound for 6 months. And that is in effect a sunset, which would happen automatically.
And you can't tweak the Fair Work Act and extend.
That was the Attorney-General Christian Porter there. You can continue watching that press conference on our COVID-19 channel, speaking about how Parliament will be sitting on Wednesday, but it will be a skeleton Parliament, and special purpose RAAF aircraft will be used to get some MPs to Canberra due to the lack of commercial flights. He also there spoke about how Parliament will be voting on that job seeker package this week.